New questions are being raised about the Obama administration's commitment to fully reverse Bush administration policies relating to the so-called war on terror. 2 weeks ago, President Obama signed executive orders to end torture and extraordinary rendition and shut down Guantanamo. On Wednesday, a British high court ruled that evidence of British resident Binyam Mohammed's extraordinary rendition and torture at Guantanamo had to remain secret because the Bush administration had threatened it would stop intelligence sharing with Britain if the evidence was disclosed. The court opinion adds that the position of the United States, quote, remains the same even after the making of the executive orders by President Obama on 22 January 2009. The Los Angeles Times also reported Sunday that the Obama administration has decided not to end the controversial policy of rendition, which gives the CIA authority to abduct anyone throughout the world and secretly transfer them to another country. The report sparked a number of debates. Scott Horton, the legal affairs contributor to Harper's Magazine, wrote in his Harper's blog No Comment that the Los Angeles Times, quote, just got punked. He points to the difference between the renditions program in place since the George H.W. Bush administration and the extraordinary renditions program introduced after September 11, 2001 and shut down by Obama's executive order. Today we host a debate on rendition and the future of counterterrorism efforts under President Obama. Scott Horton joins us here in the Firehouse studio, and we're also joined here by Michael Ratner, president of the Center for Constitutional Rights. I want to start off by just understanding what it is that President Obama signed. Michael Ratner, let's start with you. What are these executive orders? What have they ended? What have they kept in place?
Well, if we go through, there's 3 or 4 that are important. One is the Guantanamo order, which is to end Guantanamo, close Guantanamo in a year. We have some issues with that because there's what I call the 2 or 3 basket theory. The 2 baskets, which the center believes in, should be either people prosecuted or repatriated and given asylum. The order, unfortunately, gives some wiggle room for holding people without either of those 2 baskets. We have a problem with that at the center. We don't believe there's a preventive detention scheme ought to come out of that. A second order, of course, concerns interrogation techniques. And Obama does, in that order, say that the Torture Convention, the Geneva Conventions, their humane treatment ought to apply to any detainee held in the United States. Again, there's, in my view, some wiggle room in that order. One piece of wiggle room is that there is a study commission set up so the CIA can use additional techniques. A second piece of wiggle room is that it does say it's supposed to close all secret sites expeditiously. The CIA should close them all. What does expeditiously mean? And it also allows people to be held for short-term transitory purposes by the CIA. We think that's a very, very large hole. And then on the issue that you raised the debate on, but of course all these issues are issues that Scott and I discuss, the issue of rendition, the orders, in my view, still allow rendition. People would argue that it doesn't allow what's called extraordinary rendition, which is the sending of people to another country for torture. It stops that, but it still allows rendition, which I think is pretty clear it does. We are opposed to that.
Rendition meaning what?
Meaning, in the term I'm using it, is taking someone from somewhere, another country, and transferring them to another country where they can either be, for all I know, be put in secret detention or stand trial or one or the other. It really means to me going into a country, violating the sovereignty of that country, oftentimes having to use force and violence to get that person, putting that person into some way of getting them out, and we've had experience with that in a Mexican case, Alvarez Machain. They put a guy in a coffin to get him out of Mexico into the United States. So that's rendition. Even if it's for purposes of standing trial in the United States or in another country, it's still an extraordinary violation of the law to do it, even if you don't torture that person in the other country.
Scott Horton.
Well, you know, I think Michael's correct in that that these orders that were issued in the first couple of days of the administration leave a lot of questions unresolved. You know, what was the purpose of these orders? They were designed to implement a list of specific campaign promises that Barack Obama made. You heard some of them in the clip. I mean, it was the promise to end torture. So they were designed to address the interrogations program that Bush put in place, the extraordinary renditions program and the use of military commissions. Now, not every aspect of those pledges is going to be implemented through an executive order. So to see whether he's coming good on his promises, we're going to have to follow what happens with these orders, how they're implemented, and how they're worked out down the line. We're also going to have to see what these study groups conclude. So there's a lot more to be seen. But I think if we just pull back and look at the renditions versus extraordinary renditions.
The extraordinary means torture at the end of it? Is that the idea? One is the CIA can move a person from one country to another, kidnap that person. I don't think even on their end they're disputing that it's kidnapping, but they say they have a reason to do it, from one country to another. That's rendition. Extraordinary is knowing at the other end the country will torture them?
There are two elements that distinguish the old renditions program from the extraordinary renditions program. One is the CIA basically becoming a jailer, running long-term detention facilities, which was not the case previously. And the other is the involvement of torture. I mean, highly coercive tactics being used by the CIA itself, plus torture by proxy, the CIA cooperating with other nations, Morocco, like in the Binyam Mohammed case, Tunisia, Egypt, and other countries in Southeast Asia, for instance, where there's a special relationship developed, where the persons are turned over to those governments with the full understanding and expectation that they will be tortured. Now, as I read the executive orders, they clearly put an end to this extraordinary renditions program because they order the shutdown of the long-term detention facilities, and they include an unequivocal commitment to stop the torture practices. The CIA are required to abide by the same standards that are used by the Department of Defense. Of course, the proof is in the details. I mean, we're going to have to see how these rules actually are applied by the CIA, and we're going to have to look and see how the commitment not to render torture is applied. The legal standard is that someone cannot be rendered if it is more likely than not that the person would be tortured. We saw in the last administration all sorts of evasions used to get around that. I think we see a break in these executive orders, but we're going to have to see on the basis of individual cases how these orders are understood and implemented.
But if you send them to another country, how do you control how they're treated?
Well, there are things you can do, in fact. I mean, there are prior cases where first of all, I think you'd have to look at the country in question and the country's practices. And there's certain countries to which we should not be rendering individuals at all where there's any question about it. There are other countries where there's more of a borderline. And in those countries, it may be possible to work out an agreement with them to extract a clear pledge that there will be no torture and to follow up with monitoring. But, that's not going to be the case with countries like the ones I just mentioned, like Egypt and Morocco.
Let me say that, there's a few issues. I think what's really crucial here is that, yes, there's executive orders, and yes, there's a lot of wiggle room. And I think the role of citizens, of all of us as human rights people particularly, is to focus on the wiggle room and make sure that that wiggle room is not used to violate fundamental rights. So when Scott talks about closing all the secret sites, I don't think it's sufficient to say close all the secret sites, but let the CIA continue to hold people for short-term transitory purposes. Because I don't know what that means. Does it mean a week? Does it mean a month? Does it mean 2 months? Does it mean 6 months? I don't know. And so that's a big problem. Secondly, when you ban the CIA from using torture, then, and we've spoken on it here once before on your program, it's been addressed, this Annex M to the Army Field Manual. Now, the Army Field Manual is what controls interrogations of the military, and it has now been applied to the CIA. There's an annex in it that a number of human rights people, including myself, are very concerned by, that allows isolation for periods of 30 days that can be extended more, and allows sleep deprivation where you can only give the person 4 hours of sleep. That kind of stuff could, under certain circumstances, it certainly could constitute easily inhumane treatment and possibly torture. Now, there's an argument that Obama may have banned that in some way in the executive order, but there's also what he should have done, and what should be done is that it should be gotten rid of. Annex M should be taken out of the Army Field Manual.
When was it added?
It was added in it was added 2 years ago.
2006.
2006, 2 years ago, by the Bush administration as a way of saying, well, we can treat enemy combatants differently than prisoners of war. It ought to be gotten rid of. You ought to close the CIA hole. You ought to get rid of Annex M. And then I think the issues you're raising about rendition versus extraordinary rendition You know, I think it has to end. Rendition has to end. Rendition is a violation of sovereignty. It's a kidnapping. It's force and violence. And let's put it in another situation. Let's say we were planning at some point to attack Iran. Could Iran have come in here and kidnapped the people planning the attack on Iran? Could we tomorrow go down to Cuba and kidnap Assata Shakur, who is, escaped a murder charge out of New Jersey? Could we do that? Could Cuba come here tomorrow and take Posada out of Florida, the man who blew up the airliner, killing 76 people? Once you open the door to rendition, you're opening the door essentially to a lawless world. I don't accept that.
Scott Horton, why not end rendition?
Well, I think there has been